Have you ever wanted to share your story with the world or find a new way to express yourself? Today's guest has been helping people share their stories. He currently heads one of the most successful creative radio units in the world, which during his tenure have won over 200 national and international awards across all major media competitions. He's RTE's multi award winning podcaster and radio producer and creator of the world's first university accredited qualification in creative storytelling. We're delighted to have Liam O'Brien here with us today. So, Liam, thank you so much for joining us.
Not at all. Pleasure to be here. Hello, everyone.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, everybody who's tuning in, whether you're joining us via Facebook.com1 page or via the RTE website or our Go Create Academy page. You're all very welcome. And if you have any questions you'd like to ask Liam, he'd be delighted to answer them. So, Liam, one of the things that I've really learned from you is that everyone has a story to tell, and every day in every job, people are telling stories. So, what is it in your mind that differentiates a great story from a poor one?
Well, I suppose to answer the question succinctly, I think it's in the telling. I think stories are, people bandy around words like art of storytelling, craft of storytelling, 3 act structures, 5 act structures. Like at the end of the day, stories are the way we communicate. Like from the moment we're born almost, we become a story in of ourselves to, the parents, they're telling, for instance, the mother will tell about the day the child was born. Like when children go to school, they come home in the afternoons or the evenings. And what is it that they're asked? They're asked by their mom and dad, how was your day? And, they tell a story. They tell a story of the day. So, I mean, for I would say all of humanity that we're certainly aware of, that's how human beings have communicated. They have told stories to each other. They are their own story in of themselves. And I guess for somebody like myself and the wider documentary and one team, all 7 of us, like what our job is to choose stories that we feel will appeal to mass audiences, choose stories that will have a national and international impact. And then, of course, critically, it's to tell those stories in the best possible way. Everything is about, when we work as a team, it's very much about ensuring that the story, we get every grain of detail and, we really maximize the potential of that story. And then you move on to the next one.
So, speaking of the Doc on One team, you've recently enjoyed phenomenal success with the true crime series, The Nobody Zone. So, if anybody watching hasn't heard that, this docu-series has, I think some of the stats are incredible. It's had over 3 million listens via podcast, over 2 million via radio. It's been broadcast in over 5 languages, and there's some new episodes coming out. So let's have a quick listen to the opening clip, and then perhaps, Liam, you'd be so kind to tell us about it afterwards.
Before we begin, imagine this scene. You are in London. It's 1953, though. It's the day of Queen Elizabeth II's coronation, actually. But you are down in the underground at Baker Street Station. It's late, just about time for the last train. There's hardly anyone around. At the far end of the platform, 2 men show up. They seem to be arguing about something. They sound drunk. You can hear just about enough to pick out Irish accents. Suddenly, one of the men, smaller one of the two, seems to lose it completely. Just as the train is about to burst out of the tunnel, he steps up and pushes the other one right in front of the train. You're listening to The Nobody Zone, a podcast series in 6 parts, brought to you by RTE's Documentary on One in Ireland and Third Ear Productions in Denmark. My name's Tim Hinman.
So, Liam, could you tell us a little about the Nobody Zone?
Yeah, so for people, I guess, who haven't heard it, perhaps, it's essentially the story of an Irishman who went to London in the 50s and subsequently killed multiple people, or admitted to killing multiple people. And then, I guess, from a story point of view, it's very much, or at least our approach in it was, what actually happened, who did what can we believe, and I mean, they sound like really simple kind of approaches, but it takes a while to simplify down stories, especially a big story like that. I mean, what people on the webinar will have heard there is the opening of episode 1, and that is just a scene. You know, it's what you're doing there in a story point of view is you're honing down into specific small details, you know, single characters. Whereas if you opened up that story and you said, here's a story about an Irish, just what I've said there, you know, it's almost too much to take in. So, I mean, storytelling, I guess, in terms of what we do in documentary making and podcast series, is that, you know, essentially what stories are is they are an overall theme or an arc, and something changes in the middle. That's one of the critical elements to storytelling. You must kind of go from point A to point B. You know, if nothing changes in the middle of your story, you have no tension. You know, there is no story as such. It's just an outlaying of information. That's a very different thing from an actual story. So, I mean, in terms of the Nobody Zone, we broke it all down into various elements, and yeah, out the other side, what we hope to come is you get the overall sense of a story about an Irish man whose life went in a direction perhaps that few, if any of us, will ever go, in an era, in a time that absolutely coloured, you know, his life and how he reacted to those things. And again, they're big elements, and you're just trying to hone down and craft the story into a way that, you know, informs, educates, entertains, gives insight. You know, they're the layers of story that you then get to as you go through the process from a making point of view.
Okay. So, Liam, I'm hearing the sound is a little low, so we'll just try and up our volume a little bit there. So hopefully that's better. Maybe everybody can let us know if they can hear us all right there. So, Liam, you've talked about story as a series of scenes. Can you explain what you mean by that and how you do this?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the first thing in storytelling is that, you know, you need to make the information that you're telling to somebody. Is the volume okay?
Yeah, is the volume okay? Yep, great.
Great.
Thank
Yeah,
you, Paddy, for that. Thank you.
You need to ensure that the information that you're imparting is connecting. You know, it's actually connecting with the viewer, the listener, the reader. I mean, I don't think that stories are, you know, are or should be told any differently on any platform, or any broadcast media or in print, or, you know, what changes it are the technical details around it. You must have images, or you must have sound, or you must have the written word or whatever, but the actual stories themselves don't change, and the telling of them is largely the same. So, I mean, I think that refresh the question again, Susan.
Yeah, so it was just story as a series of scenes. So
Yeah, so
how you
back
think about that?
back to that connection. I mean, one of the things that allows people to connect hugely, at least in oral terms, is to visualize, is to be able to see something. And when you see something, you can feel it. I mean, in an ethereal sense, you can almost touch it, you know, you can imagine what something is like. And when you do those, when you lay out stories like that, you are placing the listener, the viewer, in that location, and you're far more likely to connect. So scenes allow you to connect first and foremost. They also allow you to authenticate stories. So there's nothing better than actually witnessing something rather than being told about it. You
Yeah.
know, they're different things.
So sorry to interrupt you there, Liam. I think the sound has gone down low again, so we'll just check that, but it should be okay now. So you've also spoken about how the best stories often have a mixture of past and present. What do you mean by that?
Well, I think by and large stories need they need context, you know, to actually matter. So they also need tension. Like that's what keeps you listening. You know, if you know the end of a story when it starts, is that an inviting, you know, way to go into the story? Are you going to Once Upon a Time, you know, the end? Are you really going to stick with that? So I think timelines allow huge context is the first thing, and they also they inherently bring attention to storytelling. So I mean, in a very simple way, you know, you have, for instance, for argument's sake, you have a person who is ill, and that's the story that you're telling. Well, you immediately have three timelines to that story. You have who was this person, what happened in their lives before they got ill. Then you have the present, which is them being ill now, and you also have the future. What is going to happen to them? Now, when you start mixing those timelines, and you perhaps hear somebody who's very ill lying in bed, and you hear you hear their story or parts of the story from when they were in when they were in their 20s. They might have been a brilliant singer. They might have been, a rubbish collection man. They might have been a judge. They might have been a sports player. It doesn't matter what. Like, it's the context to their lives, and that juxtaposition of this is how they lived their life then. This is how they're living their life now. What's going to happen to them? Like, from a story point of view, it just allows you, it gives you so much more to play with. And ultimately, of course, it allows you to tell the story of that person in a much better, stronger, and ultimately more connected way, hopefully.
So I read in the preface to Barack Obama's best-selling memoir, Dreams from My Father, he wrote that every American, inner city mothers, corn and bean farmers, immigrant day laborers, alongside suburban investment bankers, have a longing for their own story to be told. As a 4 times Prix Europa winner and one of the planet's most awarded storytellers, Liam, is this something that you found in your years of experience?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, as a team, in terms of the documentary and one, like we kind of operate, we work in two currencies. One is the currency of other people's stories, and then what we can bring to those stories. They're the two main kind of pillars of our work. Everybody absolutely has a story, and they are a story in of themselves. And we can see in the explosion of social media and so many other things over the last, say, 10, 15, 20 years, that people, they want to tell their own story. In social media, like if you have a Twitter profile and Instagram or Facebook, like what you're presenting every day is the story of your life. You know, while it might be quite banal to others, it might be exactly what you're living for or whatever. So, like, story it's become such. I guess it's been really pushed to the fore in the last 15 to 20 years. But to go back to your question, everybody has a story to tell. Not everyone wants to tell that story. That's a really important thing. And when we deal with ideas and stories, both within the team and outside of it, like there's only so far you can push a story. Like if you have a big block, which is somebody doesn't want their story told, well, you've got to ask yourself, will we be able to tell this story in the best possible way without them? That may prove to be the case, but highly unlikely. So, you just move on there. The world is full of stories. Every parish, every town, every community, every county, every country, they are full of stories just waiting to be told.
It's interesting you mentioned there about collaboration and the team. I wonder, have you found that people have come to you with a story, and when you've looked at it, you found that the story, the really interesting story, was actually something else? That maybe people think that it needs to be a bigger thing, that what the actual story that would work might be something different.
Yes, is the short answer. I mean, look, in doing the kind of job that the documentary and one team do, I think we all very much feel that you're constantly learning, you're constantly reacting. The way in which you told a story this year might be completely different from 5 years ago. The world is changing. People are changing how they listen, how they view, how they interact, what they expect from story. All of these things are changing and evolving and developing in different ways, and at different, in different ways for different people or whatever. But I guess in the thing that kind of unifies story, I think for millennia, is that to tell really big stories, you must dig down into the detail. So if you want to tell a story of love, the best way really to tell that is to find a love story, of two individuals, probably. You could have more characters, but you have to actually dig down into the layers of it. You have to be able to find the love, to identify it between the two people, to understand how it got there, where it is now, where it might be going. All those things we were talking about. You need to have the texture of it, so uh, like how does love represent itself in that particular relationship? I mean, you could be talking about a father, son, mother, daughter, lover, husband, wife, partners, civil partners, whatever. Like it doesn't, in a way, it doesn't matter who's telling the story to a certain extent. It's what that story can bring to the wider story of love. So that's a long-winded way of saying the smaller the story actually is almost always the stronger the story, because people can really feel, they can feel the story, so to tell a big story of love, what will probably happen, or a typical fault, I would say, in stories sometimes, is that they try to do too much. They try to encapsulate everything, and it's impossible to do that. So you need to, when you're initially storyboarding and choosing, that's the time to really, hone down into the detail, dig deep, pare back to the core elements of what it is you need to tell the story, and then build around that. And we're doing that in many of our productions that are currently in production. But yeah, small detail generally allows you to tell a much bigger story.
Liam, do you feel that it doesn't matter what the media output is, that the fundamental building blocks of story and story structure are the same, whether somebody's a journalist, a podcaster, presenter, and going across all media?
Yes, I do. I think as I mentioned earlier, I think the platform changes, and how you utilize a platform changes. So, like if it's a Netflix series, or which is visual, or a podcast which is oral, or it's a book which is written chapters, perhaps. I think the inner workings of story remain the same. There isn't a story structure for television. There isn't a story structure for podcasts or for any other medium. Like what there is there's story structure. There are good stories well told. There are bad stories well told. There are brilliant stories very poorly told. That's what's at stake in story. It's the how you tell it. and how you tell it in different platforms changes. But you know, the as I said to you, the you know, the innards of the story, what you're aiming for, how you're going to do it, by and large, from a story point of view, that remains kind of standard. Even things like, you know, we have barristers every day of the week and solicitors in courts around Ireland. What is it that they do when they stand up and you know, speak for their client, put their client's story forward? They are storytellers. They're telling a story. They have a very specific goal in telling the story, to perhaps aid their client getting off a conviction, or to try and result in the conviction. Like when a doctor has to deliver bad news to a patient, what is it that he or she is doing? They are telling a story. They must choose the climax point, perhaps, of telling somebody they are terminally ill is that very point. You know, I'm really sorry to say, but you have 3 months to live. Like, how do you tell that to somebody? What's the best way to tell that? And to know when to say it and at what point in the conversation. Like, it sounds very odd, but that is pure story structure. Like, if you open that encounter where the doctor's telling a patient they're terminally ill, I know this is the second ill patient I've mentioned as an example, but like, if you say, okay, you know, they come in the door and you say, okay, bad news for you, you have 3 months to live. Like, what happens then? You know, from a story point of view, it's over, you know? So, like, they're the things that we all consider. And we don't, I think many people are unaware that they actually, you know, if you were to peel back layers, they're telling stories all the time, all the time.
It's interesting you're mentioning about professionals in various areas. And I think, like, I notice a lot of brands and key influencers are now talking a lot about story. And sometimes I find when I look a little deeper that there isn't a real story there. It's more a collection of information. So what would be your top tip or tips for companies or brands or individuals who are a brand who want to share their story?
Well, I mean, this is going to sound like a, you know, very obvious thing, but you need to know what story it is you're trying to tell. That seems like the most basic thing, but actually that takes a bit of work to figure out. And once you have that identified, you then need to know, like, there should be a climax, for instance, in most stories or all stories. If there isn't a climax, there must be a really good reason why there isn't a climax. So these are the things you play with in story. Normally, if you have climax, you have a point to which you're leading, and then you have a point to which you're falling off. That's a past, present, and future. I mean, if you look in the advertising worlds, like the ads that really kind of cotton on to people, like, do you remember, you know, be it the Barry's tea ad or the Christmas Coca-Cola, like, why do you remember those ads? I would say that why you remember them is they told a story, and they told it very well, albeit in 30 seconds, but they mirrored they exemplified all the best things about story. They knew what they were telling. They had a character, they had a development, they had a timeline, they had tension, they had climax, you know, and they delivered.
So have the events of 2020, which admittedly have been completely off the charts, have they changed your story choice as a department? Like, do you feel that the stories you think people want to hear are different at the moment?
Yeah, like, it's an interesting question in that, like, stories change all the time. I think what we're probably seeing globally is, on the one hand, a thirst for information in relation to COVID, in relation to the US elections, climate change, all these type of things. But actually, in stories, you know, in you know, general media, we're looking for something other than that, perhaps. We're looking for distractions because this slew of information is everywhere. And so I guess for us, I mean, you know, people like ourselves, a public service broadcaster, you know, we need to be doing different things in different ways. So you must be reflecting the Ireland you live in today, the world you live in today, but also, you know, to get to bring deeper understanding to who it is, where it is, why it is, those kind of big questions. Sometimes stories, they need, like, will we be able to tell this story of COVID now in a way that we can tell it in a year or 18 months' time? I think when it will be told in, say, 2 years' time, that telling of the same story will be hugely different than if you're to tell it now, because now we don't really have enough time to get into the layers of around this story. Like a story, say an angle on the COVID story that I've yet to hear is, that kind of the guilt factor of perhaps a son giving it to a mother or a grandchild giving it to a grandfather, and how those things and those scenarios affect families, affect friendships. These are huge stories, and because we're living through them now, capturing them now is very different from, telling them in 2 years' time, where you are also capturing them, but you now have a context. We don't have much of a context now. So that's a long-winded way again of saying, yeah, of course, the stories we're telling now are different to the ones we tell in last year, because the world is changing.
So I read an incredible statistic recently about the amount of podcasts being created every day, but the actual number of podcasts that have, say, more than a couple of hundred listeners is not that high. To hold somebody's attention for, I think the average doc that you create is about 45 minutes. Is that correct?
Yep.
So how do you, in this day of very hard to get somebody's attention for more than a couple of minutes, how do you craft these docs to really hold people's attention throughout those 45 minutes?
Well, I guess ultimately how you do it is through, the architecture of story. Like, you need good elements to stories. So you need good tellers of the story. You need good characters, as we would call them, the people whose lives it is you're telling listeners about. But you also then need to, understand what you do with that, and how you will, connect their story to listeners. I mean, I think what's probably playing into the hand of certainly podcasts and the proliferation of them now is there is a real sense in slowing things down a bit. Like, I know we say that we live in an age of 5-second videos and, all the things that we're constantly kind of bombarded with. But the inverse of that is that there's a real value in slowing things down and slowing a story down. That's not to make it languid and boring. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm saying that, what happens a lot in the world we live in is that we skim over lots and lots of information, lots of people's lives. We hear about a disaster in an earthquake in Turkey, or, there's, on any given day, there's so much information coming at us throughout the world. But when you slow that down, and for instance, I'm sure somebody somewhere will tell the story of a family or a person or a rescue worker involved in that earthquake in Turkey, that will completely change that story, for whomever has heard it up to that point. Like, slowing stories down is, and of course, that allows you layers and depth. And it's no accident that, for instance, the Titanic movie was made 70 years after the Titanic sank, because so much of life had to pass and change for the filmmakers to write a script, to get into the depth of it. It's no accident that Watergate was a huge podcast last year, slow burn, because it takes lots of time to parse this information through. So slowing things down, there's a huge virtue to it. Sometimes I think we forget about that.
I think you mentioned it was about 13 years ago that the Doc on One team created their first podcast. Paddy has made the comment here on Facebook about getting someone's attention in the first place is difficult. Now, I mentioned in the intro just how much the Doc on One team has grown. The listenership is just incredible. So what would you say is a key ingredient if people had to have one thing that they absolutely should do for people to want to listen to their podcast? Or what have you done that you think was key to this?
Well, I guess the first thing to say is it's not what I have done. It's what collectively as a team, but also all the people who feed stories into us, who bring their stories, ultimately who trust us with their stories. But I mean, we treat, and this isn't to denigrate live content, but we treat every second, like consider every second of a 40-minute production, and I think if you don't, you're not caring, you're not nurturing your story. So, oftentimes the team would have spent, a day or two on an opening minute of a story, and that's to get it right, to jump off in the right place, to pare back the detail. You can come at stories very fast, very slow, very bright, very dark. There's all those things, but I mean, it's an entry point into the story. So I think, you know, we I think that's something for people to consider if they're making their own content is what's your entry point into this story for people? And secondly, of course, it's what story are you telling and why are you telling it? Like even sometimes when people do know what story they're telling, they can't quite tell you why they're telling the story. I'm not talking about because an answer like it's a great story or it's good or it's interesting. It's the deeper stuff like why tell this story? Why tell it now? So, I'd be trying to kind of critically, just critically ask yourself, setting out, that kind of stuff, the who, what, where, why scenario.
So going back to the Nobody's Own series for a minute, just because it's been incredible in terms of its trajectory and also it's gone across different media. So can you explain a little more about what media it's gone across and what you've sort of done there with that as a team?
Yeah, so I guess to give the context as to why we did it. So we knew we were creating a podcast series, obviously. We wanted to do a couple of things partially from a public service point of view, in that we wanted to put it on YouTube so that members of the deaf community could engage with it. Equally, for people who weren't of English not being their first language, that they would have some help. We also wanted to just utilize the platform, see what kind of growth or numbers it could give us. We collaborated with Third Ear on it, lads, in Denmark, and they had a Danish version, and subsequently through their relationship with Podimo, there was a German, a Spanish version that went out earlier in the summer. We've had approaches in other languages. It was also on the RT television player, and also on Radio 1 subsequently about a month after broadcast. But I mean, the thing that unifies all of those platforms is story. I think that, or certainly our approach nowadays as a team, is that you must go where the listeners and the users are. We don't necessarily expect people to come to us, so we will do whatever it is we can to go to them. And I mean, I think the numbers of the Nobody's Own kind of bear that out, in that our average age to listen to the Nobody's Own was 25, 30 years younger than the average age listener to Radio 1. Because radio has a certain audience, but there are other people who, for many other reasons, don't engage in radio, don't have the time, it doesn't fit in their lives, blah, blah, blah. But that doesn't mean that they're not of equal value to us, So podcasting, I guess, allows us to round that circle, and Doc and One has been, we've been a podcast first approach since about 2009. So it's not like it's an overnight success. We've built this, over many years.
Yeah, we've had some great comments coming through. Mairead has said, huge respect to Liam and the team. They do amazing work. Thank you, Mairead, for that lovely comment. It is something else, Liam, that you mentioned that I find just incredible is the trajectory of podcast series now, whether that's podcasts kind of in the way maybe a book might have before led to a film deal, the way podcasts are being looked at as possible turn into films and that side of things. So have you been seeing quite a lot of this?
Yeah, I mean, we would get, or people we work with would get book deals. Sometimes, book deals have come in, or book offers have come in. Actually, the day that the doc has been podcast, for instance, before it's aired on radio, there's lots of film interest. There was a huge amount of film interest in the Nobody Zone, and that's currently in development, shall we say? And other docs. There's lots and lots of opportunities. I mean, I think our approach is that, as I kind of, I'm repeating myself here, is that you maximize the story when you're telling it. I think when you do that, or if you succeed in doing that, or getting close to it, you then realize for others the potential of a story that perhaps was overlooked, and the smaller stories tend to get overlooked. And that then in turn brings other things like film deals, TV, but it's ultimately it goes back to the story and the fabric of it and the people in it.
It's incredible. So a couple of other questions that have been coming in, Liam. Luke has asked, how do you find a story? Do you explore the subject area, or do you find a character and a story almost fully formed?
There's no quick, easy answer to that one, Luke. Stories come in many different guises. Sometimes, we would have a story either pitched into us or within the team ourselves. And, what we do is, it sounds perhaps a little crass, but we use or at least I use the term, we move stories around the team. We kick them around the team. So, and that's quite a robust process to ensure that if we decide we are commissioning this and telling this story, that then it will ultimately satisfy audience and reach lots of people, and they'll enjoy it, and all of those things. But where we find stories, or where you can find stories, is everywhere. I mean, the simplest place, the best place, is almost always under your nose. But again, generally people look beyond that because they're thinking about something bigger. But the bigger will almost always be exemplified through the smaller. So the best stories they're the ones closest to you, because the closer you are to a story, the more you care about it. The more you care about it, the better the story. That's the reality of it.
So that's really interesting comment, because Jennifer, which is the next question I was going to relay, has said that loves the Dockham one and attended one of the seminars, but she says that finding the story is the problem.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and this is both to help you, Jennifer, and also not to pick you, but I think sometimes, I mean, I would say ideas are cheap, and an idea is a story. I think they're cheap. I think if you sat down today and you went through any newspaper, any website, any TV, radio schedule, you will see, 50 stories. What are the parts of those stories that, like they say that there's only 7 stories in the world to be told: love, loss, life, whatever. But it's the detail, it's the angle of approach. It's those things that are oftentimes the hidden gems. We're always looking for essentially hidden gems, stories that have been left behind or are currently happening, but not perhaps totally in the public eye, or certainly anyway new angles. But just look around. Like, I mean, I guess it's easy for me to say this because collectively as a team we've been doing this for a long time, and so your eye changes, your ear for an story changes. Like, for instance, the Nobody Zone came out of. I heard an interview with a guy in the radio, and I thought to myself, I don't believe that guy. What's really going on there? Got in contact with Bob Mulhern. Ronan came in the doc, Ronan Kelly. It becomes a process. But like what you're really looking for is you're looking for little bits of gold nugget, little bits of curiosity. If something piques your interest, that's a good sign that it might be of interest to somebody else, you know. And it's not to look for huge, big, sprawling stories with brilliant characters. It's to hone down on the really small detail, you know. And if something happens, just, you know, do a little investigation around what happened, who was involved. Maybe that there's a story there. They don't have to be these huge things, as I kind of keep saying.
Thank you, Liam. So I've had a question from Mark. He's said that some audio podcasts seem really familiar on first listen because we're using the same style, structures, and format. How do you avoid repeating the same structures and styles? And who internationally do you admire for unusual storytelling styles or formats? Thank you, Mark.
Yeah, I mean, it's one. I think it, you know, if you have the same person telling stories all the time, it can't but become formulaic. You know, what tends to happen is people either recognize things that work and things that don't work, and the natural thing in life is to repeat them. You know, so I think that happens in every guise of life. Storytelling is no different. What will change that for you, I guess, is one, choosing sufficiently different stories. So, for instance, if sport is your thing, or politics is your thing, or arts, or whatever it may be, like you challenge yourself in a different way. If you're choosing to tell a story about horse racing, you know absolutely nothing about horse racing. Now you have a challenge straight away to familiarize yourself to understand what the world of horse racing is about. But that is going to affect how you tell that story, because now your starting point is, I don't know anything and I've got to learn, and perhaps that becomes a story, the learning, you know. So for like formulaic storytelling is nobody wants to see or hear the same thing repeatedly, and that can happen with a format. You know, that's what format means. It means just telling the same story, really, just in different iterations. And there's good and bad to that. Like X Factor is a format. You know, it has highs and lows within it, but it's the same story every year. And there are many formats, many of which are hugely successful. But if a story doesn't have unique elements specifically to it, well, then I'd be saying possibly the wrong story to be telling, or else you haven't actually got to the heart of that story. Because every story, if you tell a story, Susan, if anybody listening in this webinar tells a story, if I tell a story, there's no way we should all be telling the same story in the same way. There should be some variety across every iteration of it. So that's the other thing about story and formula is, on the one hand, be aware of falling into patterns, but on the other hand, don't underestimate yourself in story and what each individual brings to it. To answer the final part of the question, who's doing stuff on a European or international basis? Because we work in audio all the time, I listen to very, very little content outside of what we're making. I do look to other platforms like TV, film, print, novels and stuff, but not so much to podcast. The other thing I personally am very mindful of is I don't want to become an imitator, you know, or not. It's not an imitator, but I don't. It's like you know, when Joe Schmidt or some sporting coach is asked, you know, like, how do you think the other team is going to play? I don't care how the other team is going to play. I'm concerned with how my team is going to play. It's that kind of approach. I think sometimes there's a danger with looking too much towards what other people are at. I'd be a firm believer in back yourself. You know, like we can do it as good as anyone in the world. I don't see why you couldn't. You know, it's those kind of things.
So on that, Jerry has asked, would you agree that Irish authors like Roddy Doyle and J.B. Keane exemplify stories under the nose?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, John B. Keane is, like, why are we talking? Why is John B. Keane mentioned today? Is it 10 or 15 years after John B.'s death? I'm not sure exactly, but, why do his stories of parish, of place, of person, why do they, why do they matter now? And why do they have a resonance now? I would say they have a resonance because they're of their place, they're of their time, and that's the brilliant thing about story is capturing this. And again, it's back to the same elements I keep saying. It's the smaller detail, and the smaller detail tells the bigger story. Of course, you have naturally gifted storytellers, and then you have everyone else who has to work a bit harder at
it. So Teresa has said, I research local history and I think every area is rich in stories, but it is taking the leap to go from research one story in detail that holds people back. So I think the question is around, it is that thing about what stops you from starting. What would you say is the main thing that stops people from starting, Liam?
Ultimately, it's always themselves. In terms of what we do, like people have a tendency to put barriers up for themselves. I would say if you think you have a story, start doing your best to try and tell it. Like especially if it's something you haven't particularly done before. It's along the way and even simple things like we often talk about in the team that you tell a story to somebody else over a pint, over a cup of tea, whatever the scenario, socially distanced scenario is nowadays, you see their reaction. If they change the conversation, it's like, okay, obviously that story didn't interest them too much. There are ways to check out. I mean, one thing we haven't really discussed in the webinar is a critical point of stories and story choice for us always is the who tells the story, and especially with historical stories. You can tell historical stories largely in two ways. One, they are rooted and they remain in the past, or two, you can try and bring something else to them to bring a kind of contemporaneous element. So that's either searching for the truth, perhaps that's in the history, or paralleling it with what's happening now, or looking at it in a new way that it hasn't been looked at before, bringing something new to it. But history stories in of themselves throw up issues because you largely are dealing with second-hand information. Yes, you might have a witness, but it's normally in print. And so who's going to tell that? And, there are other small considerations, but ultimately it's down to quality of story always.
So we've had a couple of other questions coming in here. We'll just try in the last few minutes get through these. Michael has asked, did you ever think that a particular story would make great TV?
Yes. I would say, I mean, I'm not going to say it's a bugbear, but like I don't personally view a difference of platform. So whether a story is told in television or radio or podcast, it doesn't make the story any better or any worse. In the world we live in now, you don't get any bigger audiences or smaller audiences, largely speaking, on whatever platform you're on. It's almost always back to the quality of story. You have stories, of course, that are more naturally visual. If you're telling a story about, for instance, an athlete, to see that athlete in action, will inform that story in a way that you can never capture in radio if I'm talking about an athlete, or if he or she is even talking about themselves. So sometimes stories are more visual, of course they are. Sometimes they're more oral, where actually perhaps not much is happening, but there's a huge story taking place. So I would say, like, of the documentaries that we aired this year, of which there's, I don't know, the bones of 20, every one of them could just as easily have been a television documentary, told perhaps slightly differently, there's lots of other considerations, but potentially they're the same. I mean, I don't see the platforms as distinctly different in that respect.
I think that's really interesting, Liam. I've heard you say that a number of times, and I think that's something for people to really take on board, is that merging of platforms in that way, that a story is a story and you can be cross-platform. Going back to your question on who tells the story, Luke has just asked there, do you think there's a place for first-person storytelling and injecting the narrator into broadcast radio?
Yes. I mean, it's there's no yes or no scenario really, or right or wrong. I mean, it kind of comes back to what serves the story best. In our own instance and in many other broadcasters, sometimes that will be first person led. The person who is the story is the person narrating the story. You have other considerations. Other broadcasters will feel that personality of some description must be included as the person who tells the story, for a variety of different reasons. But I mean, the only question for us, or I would encourage people to think that the only question for them in making stories is go back to the basics. Like, what's the best way to tell this story? Like, if you feel that you need to have a celebrity voice, for instance, what will that bring to it other than the voice, other than the person? How will it change your story? Now, if it can fundamentally change your story if you chose the right celebrity. These are, like, what I mean by that is, say you're telling the story of an up and coming soccer star. A young child, a family have just, agreed that the 12-year-old son will go play for Aberdeen in the academy, and he's left home, and really traumatic time in a young child's life. If Robbie Keane tells that story, or Cristiano Ronaldo, or they are going to bring something unique to that because they've lived that journey themselves. Whereas if J-Lo or Kim Kardashian, they're going to bring nothing to that, only their personality. So everything is about choice, of course. And ultimately, I'd be encouraging people to say, when they're making their choices, the only context and value is, how will this improve the story?
Brilliant. Thank you, Liam. So Rory has also kind of asked in relation to that. First of all, he has said he loves Doc on One. Thank you, Rory. And the output has only got better and better over the years. And congrats on all the awards. He wants to ask specifically on who tells the story, the narrator. How often is this not the person who discovers, pitches, or researches the story, especially for overseas African-based stories? Thanks, and keep up the great work.
Thanks, Rory. It's interesting to hear you say that we've improved, which is, it kind of goes back to the point of the learning, and reacting and changing. And any year that we do the same thing we've done the previous year is a bad year, I would say. It's static, it's all those things. So that's a way of answering the question of the who tells the story. There are many considerations when you're telling the story. I mean, one of the considerations you're asking there, for instance, about the African community, one of the key considerations for our audiences always is comprehension ability. Can somebody fully understand this? And if they can, that's not an issue. But that can sometimes be an issue once you move outside the country. We have found over the years hugely, and particularly when we look at our podcast statistics, that once a story that we're telling moves outside of Ireland, there is a huge drop off in audience. That's not of our making. That's the listeners deciding. That is universal, and it has happened consistently over the last 10 years. And the flip side of that is that internationally, the international traffic that we receive, they actually come to us for Irish stories. So obviously, as a public service broadcaster, that does not mean we don't tell stories outside of Ireland, but it does mean that they must have an Irish context, ideally an Irish link, ideally an Irish character, because that will allow those stories connect with Irish listeners, and thus it'll allow that story to be told as good as we can probably make it.
Thank you, Liam, and thank you, Rory, for the question. Therese has asked, how important do you think that the storyteller has a genuine passion in the interest in the story that they choose to tell? Or can you tell a story without that?
You can tell a story without that, but you will probably tell it so much better if you have passion. I mean, I think people underestimate the amount of work involved in telling a story. Like for a 40-minute doc, it's generally, we record roughly 30 minutes content for every minute that you hear. Could be 40 minutes sometimes, could be 20 others. It's generally speaking 3 months work spread out over 12, 18, 24 months, whatever. And even if it's only a 15-minute documentary, or whether it's like The Nobody Zone, which is becoming an 8-part series with the release of the 2 new eps at the end of this month. And, that's a story of, it'd be 320 minutes or something. Like, it doesn't matter the overall duration. There will be peaks and troughs as you're moving through the production of your story. And you'll have low points where you feel the whole thing is falling apart. You'll have high points of elation where you discover something or something clicks but like, if you don't have a passion for it throughout all of that, the low points will become lower. The high points won't be as high, And I think when you get out the other end, you're unlikely to have delivered a story as good as someone who had that passion, And I think to say a passion for storytelling might even be too big a thing. I think it's just a natural kind of humanity, a curiousness for life, for stories. All of those things really matter hugely when you're telling stories, especially other people's stories.
Thank you, Liam. Eric has asked if you could give some simple tips on equipment for recording, editing, and audio documentary.
Yeah, in terms of equipment, I would say what we use stereo microphones for all our recordings. For people not up to speed, essentially stereo allows you to see wide, so a left and a right. It's kind of like, I would describe it as a color camera as distinct from a black and white camera. So you see more detail. If you're starting out, I would say use a mono microphone, which is just for speech. You will hear some background noise, but not much. If you're on your if you're on a mobile phone or a dictaphone or a Zoom, something that will help people hugely is when you're recording, try and hold the microphone at the chest as distinct from the mouth. There's 2 reasons. One, when someone is communicating a story to you, it's not so nice to tell a story when there's a hand in front of your face, So you want people to have eye contact with you when you're asking questions. I know a very basic thing, but so you try and keep the equipment out of at least eye contact. And equally, you're likely to get a better sound. You'll hear the resonance of someone's chest if your microphone is down here, be it a phone or a microphone or whatever. You need to figure out the proximity. Different microphones will have different, what they call pickup patterns. Generally speaking, we want people to sound clear, like hopefully I'm sounding now. That's because I'm on mic. If I put my microphone over there, I presume you probably heard a difference in the sound. Like that's off mic. You don't want any elements getting in the way of allowing you to connect with your listener. In terms of editing, I keep it very basic. If people are starting out, use a free piece of software like Hindenburg. Use 2 tracks. One where you have your narration perhaps or your music. Another track where you have the scenes or other people's interviews that you've recorded. We use Pro Tools as the industry standard. Like some of our documentaries could have 8, 10, 12 tracks of sound happening at one time. As a listener, you should never be able to spot that. You should just feel, of course, you should be sucked into the story. So it's just a texture that you're hearing or feeling but that's how it works.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Liam. So we're just about out of time. I've got one last question from Facebook, which is from Kieran, and he has asked, Does Liam have a favourite Duck on One, and why? Great question, Kieran.
Oh, I have many favorites. I mean, I think, you know, what generally happens from a maker's point of view is that I remember some amazing experiences of actually recording. And sometimes that gets mixed up, you know, incorrectly with the end product. And sometimes you go out and you feel that what you're recording isn't so great. But when you get it home and you listen to it in this is my little mini studio here, in a detached environment, you hear something completely different. I couldn't give you a favorite, and I kind of don't want to give you a favorite because, I mean, I guess one of the most important things for us as a team is that very much every Doc and One production that goes out, be it made by Sarah, Tim, Donal, Michael, Ronan, myself, Nicoline, 7 of us, it doesn't matter which one of us is involved in making it. We all help each other out, and that it's impossible to say how important that is to the end engagement, to the listener, to the standard, to the way stories unfold. It addresses all the things that people are kind of concerned about there, like formulaic structure and telling the same story in the same way. And when you have people feeding in like that, it's such a huge help. And equally, you know, I'm not going to say this. Which documentary is my favorite? That's for you.
You said that was a very diplomatic answer. Thank you for the question, Kieran, and thank you everybody so much who's been tuning in and watching this. Now, before we finish, given that we are living in a pretty, let's face it, depressing time at the moment, we've got a couple of light-hearted questions to ask Liam, who has so kindly given us his time for the last hour before we finish up. So Liam, let's go with a few questions and then we just say thank you very much. What do you think was the best invention of the 20th century?
Mobile phone.
Fantastic. Right. We've got a time machine, Liam, and you can go back and visit Liam as a 20-year-old. What one piece of advice would you give yourself as a 20-year-old?
Difficult one. Probably cut that mullet, will you?
I'm going to be diplomatic in my answer. And finally, Liam, we've just deposited £1 million, or €1 million, I should say, in your bank account, and you've got a mobile phone and 3 minutes to spend it. What are you going to buy?
For myself?
Yes.
Probably a farm.
Fantastic. Definitely the first time I've had that answer. But thank you so much, Liam. Thank you so much for everybody who's been watching and sharing this passion that we all have for storytelling and story. And thank you so much to your whole team, Liam, for all the wonderful docs that you are continuing to make day in and day out. And hopefully we'll get to have another webinar with you again like this in the future.
Great. Thanks, Susan, and thanks for everyone who took the time to tune in.
Thank you.